Welcome, John.
Hello, hi.
Here. Hey.
Is this working? Great, excellent.
Yes, so I'm going to introduce you real quick.
Okay.
You got your quick bio and we'll get you started. So John is the CEO of Dagger Consulting. He continues to serve as an independent director on several of the world's largest asset managers, including digital assets, where he represents the interests of limited partners in a fiduciary capacity. We're very excited to have you. So John, can you tell us really how has governance succeeded and failed over time in response to ESG? And we can take it from there.
Okay. I'm going to try to share my screen if that's
Awesome.
if that's okay. Tell me if that worked.
We see
Did
it.
that work? Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I thought the best way to answer this question, we have about 12, 15 minutes. So I'm gonna go through a very truncated version of a class I teach in governance and fintech at MIT and Columbia, which normally takes between 3 and 4 hours. And so I've distilled it down, and I think I realized in doing that I don't really need to teach for 3 or 4 hours. Just quickly walking through a couple of slides here. So generally, again, reminder, there may be lawyers in the room, is like explaining algebra to a mathematician. So apologies for being pedantic, but it does serve to remind even boards that I serve on for some of the largest asset managers in the world, what the role of a board is, and why it's complex, and why when you add in I would say maybe a few years ago, non-quantifiable, although the data has now gotten really good around ESG. But anything where there's gray areas of the nature of how something can be quantified, why it becomes difficult for board members to act, not just because they're bad actors or don't believe in the underlying thesis, but because there are sort of structural and legal requirements that create problems for directors and fiduciaries. So as any of you who are in the legal profession or executives might know, boards are direct fiduciaries to companies, act in good faith, exercise power for the benefit of the company, not necessarily the shareholders of the company, but the company overall. My little test in the beginning is if I say, well, what if 98%, if 100% of the shareholders of a company called an EGM, extraordinary general meeting, and voted to burn all of the cash and treasury in a big pile, what would you do as a director? It's an interesting thought exercise around the role of directors as conduits for LP and shareholder interests versus not. Again, avoiding conflicts of interest, which is easier said than done. And again, this is very U.S. centric, but pretty much every country, it's kind of roughly the same thing in spirit. You have a duty to act with care and skill, which are very subjective. How is one? Most directors do not have the underlying skill sets of the management teams on which boards they serve. We've seen this in many classic examples. Particularly, this involves my area of study and expertise, which is the intersection of fintech and asset management. And as we see, as it becomes, and this extends to cryptocurrency. Diana, thank you for the intro. I'm also a senior advisor to Coinbase, and I am currently controlling and governing a SPAC that is buying a Bitcoin miner, and I'll be joining that board. So it's a lot of issues around ESG and intersection of technology and finance. So it's subjective. Those of you who are reading on the Theranos story, were they skillful enough? By all objective measures, these were luminaries in their respective industries. I don't believe any of whom had any advanced degrees in biochemistry or any of the technologies underpinning Theranos. And so what I would look for as a governance expert is I would look to see minutes where someone on that board raised their hand and said, how come we can accomplish something with 1/100th of GE's budget on R&D that they can't? And if nobody asks that question, you have a problem from a duty and skill perspective. But I certainly don't expect anyone to be lied to by an engineer and be able to replicate their math or replicate their experiment to prove that. So just a bit of context as to what I think some boards are facing with regards to ESG, given the lack of clarity around certainly not the science around climate change, I believe, is currently defined and objective, but for some of the social aspects of it, it's challenging for them to find out where they can rely on if they were ever challenged by an opposing and contrarian group of shareholders to show that they have duty, care, and skill in a specific underlying thesis that drives a governance decision. So I'll stop there. Ask the question again so I can get the second part of it. Apologies, and keep continuing, Diana.
It's basically how governance had succeeded and failed over time in response to ESG. And then following on that, what's the importance of governance for ESG? Why is data important? And what's the role of governance solutions?
Right. Okay. So how is governance? Again, I'll speak to my area of expertise, which is asset managers, and the last presenter I know at the end spoke about that. I think broadly, ESG considerations have failed in the fund world, at least. And my evidence of this is the SEC has now put down has dropped a gauntlet on increasing their oversight and probably fines and sanctions against funds that are greenwashing. So I remember it's probably 5-6 years ago. I have regular meetings with the SEC to discuss market structure and sort of overall as a fiduciary to LPs. I'm kind of on the side of the regulator in some way, and so developed this relationship with the SEC and FCA and other regulators. And I remember like even 4 or 5 years ago being asked like, well, walk me through like. We're starting to see more and more information about ESG in marketing documentation. So what are the funds actually doing behind the scenes to justify them marketing themselves as ESG friendly? And the answer was, very little. And the justification back then was, well, no one's told me what I need to do. No one's even told me if I need to think about, my management company. So I need to employ good practices at my management company, which may be 30 employees managing $20 billion of assets, or the portfolio itself, or the underlying portfolio companies, which, by the way, I may, even though I'm a large asset manager, I may only have a small position and I have no ability to change that. And what do I do? Okay, so now, a couple of years ago, now I can buy MSCI indices or data that shows me generally with listed instruments with a CUSIP or a ticker, what their rank and score is. That's great. How does that apply to shorting? Am I responsible for shorting companies that have low scores? Does that even, given that when you short something or you sell something, you're just transferring ownership and risk to another LP, another shareholder, does that really even affect the company in any way, shape, or form? So there was, I think, reasonable for a few years at least. It was reasonable kind of way you could obfuscate the need to actually do something substantive. And so what most funds were doing is they were developing a policy in-house that was, quite frankly, kicking the can down the road and just, really doing the bare minimum to be able to say we aspire to be ESG compliant. They would, tap into the UN PRI rules, and they would develop a rough sort of estimate of how they conform to them. But there was really quite frankly, there was no consequence for breaching, for not acting in good faith. In general, again, it's changed recently, but 4 or 5 years ago, the large LPs that were pushing this, with the exception of a very few number of sovereigns, usually mostly the Nordics, that were really kind of aggressively pushing this issue on a substantive basis, most large LPs, pensions, sovereigns, et cetera, were wanting the funds to pay lip service to this issue. Just give me a policy statement. I'm not even going to open it. I don't care. Just give me something that I can just put in a shelf somewhere to say that, you've done this, and now I can invest in the fund that I want to have access to. That's highly problematic. We knew it was problematic years ago. I'm glad the SEC is now cracking the whip on this greenwashing because it'll force, again, mostly it's the GPs, the managers, who get the blame. I put equal blame on the LPs because they were as complicit and have been as complicit in this sort of mirage of ESG compliance for asset managers that there's no press on this, right? This is no press. Okay, I hope so. There's no, but now we're seeing not just the EU is far ahead. We're seeing U.S. regulators really cracking down on greenwashing and making sure that there's real substance behind this. And if you claim you're checking any of these boxes, you have not just a piece of paper that says how you'll do it, but you have board minutes and you have a codification of the process by which you underwent governance, and those in charge of governance, including independent directors and board members who have no real day-to-day role in the company, are ultimately responsible, just like we're responsible for signing off on the audit. And you can't say, well, I didn't notice that the expense ratio went up by 3 times and I just signed off. You have a responsibility, unless you can prove that you were defrauded, you have a responsibility to show duty, care, and skill to ensure that you did, a reasonably good effort to ensure the audit was fair. Same thing for ESG policies. So I can tell you for sure that the nature of these board meetings has changed substantively. So, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the SEC and regulators made a big focus on cybersecurity, the board started to really crack the whip on managers, making sure they had the right policies, procedures, vendors. It used to be that your CTO was somebody who knew how to kind of run an API into a broker dealer and could like wire up your new laptop and make sure the patches were all in place. That was your cybersecurity expert for 5 years. And they didn't know a thing about, they're very, very smart, technical, the kind of person you call to fix your computer, but knew nothing about cybersecurity. Now that's extremely rare. Now it's very, very rare that you'll see a CTO that doesn't have deep cybersecurity expertise. And if they don't, they have a separate cybersecurity specialist. The same thing is starting to happen with ESG. For funds that are marketing themselves as ESG funds, they're bringing in consultants like the former speaker. Exactly. They're bringing in substantive people that can show that this is not just greenwashing. This is not just showing face. That they're really putting policies in place to affect change.
Exactly.
With regards to the role of data, yes, I won't skip through this. This is I like this slide. One of the reasons that this is becoming increasingly important is there's so much drive, there's so much more increased drive and emphasis to invest early in these fintechs for a bunch of different reasons. One of which is this you may have seen this as the Gartner hype cycle. This is what gets everybody really scared about missing out on the boat and maybe just ignoring some of the ESG considerations because they want to get in early and I'll affect change later. When I teach this class to executives about not falling for some of this bunk, I remind them that there's this lovely curve at the end that makes it seem like everything works out okay, when in reality, about 80% of tech goes in that direction. So people kind of forget about that. So there's a lot more, boards are under a lot more pressure to move quickly. Particularly for large incumbents, because private companies are able to stay private for so much longer and compete. It used to be that you could just kind of wait out startups, and if they weren't profitable in like 3, maybe 4-year time frame, you could buy up the assets. 89% of companies that went public last year on the NASDAQ and NYSE were EBITDA negative. I may be a little bit off, but I'm directionally correct. And these are companies that have been allowed to stay EBITDA negative for 7, 10, 15 years. So we've never been more generous in the private markets, both debt and equity, in allowing these companies to stay active. And so there's enormous pressure among incumbents. JP Morgan just announced $12 billion in fintech spend. So this is kind of what's driving the pressure on boards to move fast and not ask questions like, are they, how are you going to ensure that this company that you buy fits into our ESG policies? Because it's like buying a house in today's market in the suburbs, right? If you don't put the offer down the day you see the open house, you're going to miss the boat. So that's increasingly problematic. How are we on time, Diana?
We're good on time.
Okay.
You can keep going unless we get more questions from the audience.
Okay. So I'll skip to some of the major fintechs you might have heard about and some of the governance issues that occur that touch ESG. I was on the board of an MIT spinout that promised to radically redefine how we give out loans. And the age of FICO was dead, and it was a racist and bad methodology. And we're going to use AI, and we're going to pull in debit card data and other types of mobile phone data, and we'll use an AI overlay, and we will radically improve credit financing, especially for the 1.3 billion people that are unbanked or underbanked. Again, in theory, fantastic idea. Wonderful technologists with really good intentions, people I know personally well, who I know want to do better for the world, wrote all the code, was governed by MIT luminaries, and we hit go, and within about 15 minutes, it was breaking every rule, both moral, social, and legal, and it was redlining, which is something you're not allowed to do. It was creating communities of people by geography, race, or type, and saying, hey, you have to not lend to them or give them a higher interest rate. And so, these are massive problems, right? And you don't have the ability as governors to just say, well, I didn't know, I didn't understand, right? You have to stay on top. And of course, I don't understand the code. I don't understand the mathematics behind it, but that's no excuse. And so part of my thesis is that directors going forward will have to have continuing education requirements in things like technology and ESG, similar to the way that lawyers and accountants and auditors have to keep up with their education. I find it, odd that a director can sit on the board of the analogy I give, if I'm on the board of Ralph Lauren, I don't have to be a fashionista, but I kind of have to know the difference between a single and double-breasted suit. right? It'd be a bit silly if I didn't. So similarly with governance and fintech, as we start to the integration of ESG components into highly complex fintechs is not going to be seamless. It's not going to be easy. We'll have to make compromises. We'll have to understand where we give and where we take, and when we take the throttle off, because the problem can't be solved by technology. And that just takes education and learning, and that takes the ability to, again, even assuming that the management are not bad actors, which is a completely different problem. Enthusiasm and delusion there's a very fine line between enthusiastic optimism and delusion. So you've got to be able to question those things.
Right. I'm going to interrupt you, John, with a question here because I think it's relevant.
Sure.
Are companies reluctant because they don't want to be accountable? If they have a process and they document it, then that can come up during the discovery process, and they obviously don't want that. Absolutely. But on the flip side, why wouldn't you put in place this process and then avoid the situation ever getting to a discovery or lawsuit area? Is it a matter of maturity ultimately, or is it just a mindset in certain industries?
It's a great question. And I wonder if the person who wrote it, if the person who wrote it was American versus British, they would have two very different approaches, because the UK has a principle-based regulatory system for financial services, and the US has rules-based. And so depending on which one you grew up in, you're more comfortable in that area. So it also depends. There's another bifurcation in the asset management world specifically. Who are you targeting and what are their rights? If you are a fund that's only dealing with institutions and qualified purchasers, you have more of an ability to be principles based, and because you have more wiggle room. Whereas if you are targeting retail, you have to be much more prescriptive in what you say and what you do. And that's certainly, I'm not an attorney, but certainly it leaves the door open more but I've seen managers, there used to be sort of a thesis amongst asset managers. It was better to be a generalist. And then these are usually very reactive stances. So it's better to be a generalist until the SEC comes down and dings in a very public way a manager for being too generalist. Then it becomes in vogue, and all the lawyers will advise you to be very, very prescriptive and specific and list every single thing. And that does protect you, because if you do something or you're accused of not doing something, you can go back and say, well, wait a second, I listed every single thing we said we do. It wasn't in that list. And so by definition, you can't expect me to have done it. But then to the person's point, then you open up the door for a really smart litigation attorney or regulator to attack you because you've given them too much specifics. So there's really no right answer there. I think it comes down to the culture of the firm. It comes down to who they are targeting for their demographic, who their regulator is, what part of the world there is. I will say right now, there's more of a penchant for principle-based guidance around these policies. Again, I don't necessarily believe this, but the rationalization is especially in the US, we don't have as much clarity as we have in Europe. How can I write a substantive detailed policy when there's still all this vagary around what's expected of me from the regulator, from my LPs? I have to appease, offshore investors, and they've got, much more rigorous rule sets there. And so in general, US asset managers specifically, I can't say for regular public companies, are veering towards being a little more generalists. And then if they want to get specific, they'll hire someone like Diana to come in and write that detailed policy statement for them.
The person is Canadian, by the way.
She does. Sorry?
The person is Canadian, by the way.
Oh, okay. So kind of in the middle. Influence on both sides. I'm not an expert on Canadian law, but yeah. So
I'm going to move you on to one more question, as we only have a few more minutes, and then we can keep going. How do you envision this space and ecosystem interacting with the Web3 world?
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, because Web3, vastly oversimplifying, but Web3 believes that you just don't need people for a lot of this stuff, and that you can write code that handles. And again, any lawyers in the room, feel free to jump into the chat about how you feel about that. The question I always ask lawyers is, if a client came to you and said, I have a very complex transaction coming up, I want to encode the whole thing on a smart contract, how would you advise them? Is that smart or not? It's always amazed me how two very smart people with integrity can look at the same sentence of a given language and come up with very, very different interpretations of what that means. So look, I think if the world, I'm not sure there's any greater world-changing technology right now than Web3 in the sense of it redefines corporate securities laws, property laws, contract law. I mean, everything has to be rewritten if we shift to a world where you can just issue a protocol onto a system, onto a bunch of nodes, step away from ownership or control of that protocol, and have that protocol engage in the matching up of financial transactions, complex financial transactions, right? So all bets are off in terms of what that means. I kind of, maybe this is me just revealing my age, but I kind of stand, I go back to my example of the MIT spinout. I struggle to believe that this will not cause meaningful problems, both from bad actors who will try to use that opaqueness to subvert the spirit of these rules, of these ESG rules, both social rules and legal regulatory rules, and also just these systems the participants in these systems tend to flow towards the least path of resistance. And the least path of resistance with ESG tends to be, again, not sticking to the spirit and trying to come up with the least substantive response to these very serious problems. So I'm a little bit skeptical of our ability today. Maybe my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, maybe she'll live in a world where the AI is strong enough to adapt this code. You'll often hear Web3 people say that code is law. Code is the opposite of law, because law is not mutable. Law changes, law adapts, law informs. Not an attorney, but I hope the attorneys agree with me. Whereas code is immutable. So I find our mores change, our rules change, our science changes, right? We will know things in 10, 15 years we don't know now. And so I don't know if I'm really comfortable with an immutable bot controlling these transactions that have so much potential impact on ESG in every way, shape, and form.
Excellent. We are out of time, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
And you are great as always. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your
Cheers.
time.